Min Canaday here. You are listening to the Trips and Global on Wheels podcast hour, the place to be to learn about the latest and greatest life stories from people who are doing incredible disability advocacy work. Jennifer Smith Mary, welcome to the Trips and Global on Wheels podcast hour.
Hi, it's good to be here.
So I'm going to read your bio just to give our listeners and viewers a bit of context, okay?
Mm-hmm.
Dr. Jennifer Smith Mary is Associate Professor in the Faculty of Health Sciences at the University of Sydney. Jen is the Director of the Center for Disability Research and Policy. Jen also leads the mental health and disability research in the faculty. Jen has a PhD in policy from the University of Queensland, and her academic research has focused on policy and service development, primarily in mental health and the study of adverse events. Prior to her current position, she was a research fellow at the University of Edinburgh. Welcome again. So we're going to start off our first question with, I know we just read your bio, but can you put into your own words, introduce yourself to our listeners and viewers?
Sure. Well, I think I'd call myself a policy academic, and that sounds really boring. And in fact, I once told someone said, "Oh, you're an academic, that's great. What do you study?" And I said, "Policy." And they went like, "That sounds really boring." But for me, it's really interesting. And that's because what brought me into policy was actually initially I was working in aged care services, and I noticed that policy decisions made at a government level, when it actually came down to being implemented within services, could mean something like people got less bread to eat on the table when I was giving out their food. So I became really interested in how can we make policy decisions that better reflect what people actually need. So in terms of disability policy, my interest is in how can the lived experiences of people with disability be shared in a way that make meaningful change within policy. So I'm interested in that connection. And a lot of my work is focused on mental health. And I've actually moved mainly into disability in the last 5 years or so. So in Australia, we've had a big policy change called the National Disability Insurance Scheme, which I can tell you a little bit about later, which has revolutionized the way that we think about disability policy and services in Australia and the way that the whole system functions, really. And so that's become a large part of my work. And like a lot of people working within disability, I have a personal connection in that one of my children has disability. And I also have a lot of connections with people with lived experience of mental health problems and disability.
In regards to your work as a disability advocate, CDRP or other areas that you've done, other places that you've done disability advocacy work, who has shaped you the most? What role models do you have? Is influences from family members and friends? I know you say you have a child with disabilities, so that inevitably shapes your work, I'm sure.
Mm-hmm.
What influences your work and how you approach disability advocacy?
I think I'm very much influenced by the people with lived experience of disability that I come into contact with every day through my work. I think it's a constant process of learning because I don't hold that experience myself. So I need to learn and talk to people in order to understand their lived experience. The people that have been most influential for me are the people who make connections all the time. So they make connections to policymakers, they're talking to services, they are talking to people with lived experience, and therefore that makes their work as an academic relevant. So there needs to be some sort of mechanism for having that information go into the place where actually policy is being written. And often that is absent. So the best way for that happening is actually having people with lived experience of disability involved in actually writing the policy. But often that's missing.
Mm-hmm. And that's when I think integrating and having more people with disabilities who have the lived experience, but also the academic and professional background to
Yep.
convey it. So I know you recently led the development of the Mind the Gap report, right? In the NDIS and psychosocial disabilities. So what are the key findings of this report? What are some gaps and solutions that you suggested? And also touch on the complexity of trying to include so many different types of disabilities in this scheme, in the National Disability Insurance Scheme, because as you know, if you look at the history of disability, a few decades ago, it was people with physical disabilities that was considered a disability.
Yeah.
And then later, more severe forms of mental disabilities, more should I say obvious forms of mental, intellectual, cognitive forms were included. And then now we have different mental health situations that are also included. And so with more and more people considered disabled and many people being able to make the case for that, how does that further complicate the process of creating a national scheme, healthcare scheme for such a broad group of people, and making sure that financially you're able to cover everybody appropriately?
Okay, yeah, they're really great questions. So I'll just start by telling you and your viewers about the National Disability Insurance Scheme, because it's sort of a unique scheme. So in Australia, we were really falling behind in the social inclusion of people with disability compared to other OECD countries. So people were living pretty marginalised lives, and they were not being included in society. So the National Disability Insurance Scheme was brought in by our Prime Minister Julia Gillard, former Labor Prime Minister Julia Gillard, and it is actually a really great scheme, because at the heart of it is this idea that people with disability should be in the community. They should be living meaningful lives, and that we need to put in place social supports that will allow them to do that. And that it's a human right that they're involved in society. So in order to do that, the National Disability Insurance Scheme was created. It was created through an increase in taxation in Australia, which people were quite happy with, and through closing down other programs and rolling them into the NDIS, which has caused some problems, which I'll talk about in a minute. It's only for around 690,000 Australians, and that means that it's only for people with quite severe functional impairments. And that means that it doesn't cover all people with disabilities. So individuals who apply to the NDIS are assessed, and then depending on their functional needs in particular areas, they're provided with individual budgets, and they can choose how to spend that money within those confines. So they can say, okay, well, I'm going to choose this provider to provide me with assistance for showering or going out to social functions or things like that. So there's budgets, and people can decide what to do with them themselves. So that's really good, because it's saying, okay, you're the person, you know your life, you choose. It's done on a market-driven approach, so that a market is meant to be created around disability, where people are able to choose providers. In reality, it doesn't work so well, because in some areas there's no market. So in remote and regional in Australia, there's not very many services, and they're very expensive to run. And they're particularly expensive to run for people with very high, maybe behavioural or psychosocial disabilities. And so they may not have any services to choose from. So that's one of the problems that we were highlighting in our report.
I see. And so these are for the most severe cases where they're unable to work. And if reasonable accommodation is possible, then it wouldn't be given to those individuals with disabilities, right?
Yeah, I think you're looking at, okay, if they're able to function in their lives at the moment with the accommodations that are in place that they get from other, publicly funded government schemes, so they're not spending thousands of dollars out of pocket, then yeah, they don't need the NDIS. That would be a reasonable assumption. But for a lot of people, they hadn't been getting very much support and were living fairly marginal lives and were not able to function appropriately. So the aim would be you're putting functional supports in place so people can be more included, and then they can be employed themselves. And ideally, an individual's reliance on the NDIS might decrease over time as people are more able to provide for themselves. I don't know the extent to which that is happening yet.
I see. Interesting. So what do you hope to personally achieve through being a part of the Center for Disability Research and Policy?
I hope to achieve a better life for people with disability, the life that they should be living if society weren't putting obstacles in their way. We need to not put obstacles in people's way. We need to put accommodations in people's way so that we can help people to live the lives that they should be living.
And what is that better life? What components are you hoping to be there that are currently lacking?
I think inclusion in society. Number one, employment. We have very poor employment rates for people with disability in Australia. We have so few employers that are wanting or feel able to employ people with disability. And it's not because people's disabilities are too complex. We lack a disability confidence amongst employers. So people think, oh, I don't know anything about disability. I'm not going to be able to employ people. So we have very low literacy in our society about the reality of disability and the reality of things like employing people or including people with disability. So the change is trying to change society so that people see people with disability, understand, so that, see people in society, understand that people with disability can be accommodated in appropriate ways so that they can thrive, and that people, then there's a knock-on effect. So employers think they're able to employ people, and then employment levels might rise.
So I know you did some work. I think you mentioned Scotland earlier, right? So I read one article that says that the UK has a reputation for having progressive mental health policies. Can you share with us what are some of the policies that you think are progressive in the UK and how Australia and the rest of the world can emulate them?
Yeah, so I think I was specifically talking about Scotland. My research has been on Scotland rather than the UK as a whole, and Scotland's actually quite different to the rest of the UK. And it has a very different government. It's got a different system of the way that it provides health and social care services. And it has a very strong sense of its own social justice ethic. So it comes from a place, really living there, you get the sense that people, they have a really strong value of equality and social justice that you sort of don't sense in other places. And Scotland, I think, has taken that and put it in mental health policy and gone, it is not right that we exclude people. It is not right that people are living these marginalised lives. So we're going to do quite radical things to change that. We're going to try and change the way that we think about mental health. So they were one of the areas that countries that first put recovery into their mental health system and said, we value the experiences of people with mental health problems. So we're going to include them. We're going to employ them in organizations. We're going to share their knowledge and voice and narratives at a high level so that people can understand this experience, and we can shape our psychiatric services and psychology services so that they're more inclusive of lived experience. And them doing that has enabled other countries to emulate that experience and take on that policy. So they led the way, and then other countries have gone, okay, they can do it, well, we'll try it too.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. So with this movement being so multifaceted and complicated and progress relatively slow and comparatively, what motivates you and sustains you to think optimistically for the future, thinking that each day you're going towards progress?
Well, sometimes I don't think I'm going towards progress, but then I think I have conversations or I see people's lives being changed at a basic level. And I see that, yeah, actually things are moving forward. I look at someone who's got an NDIS plan and suddenly, their child who previously was getting 1 hour support in school every day is getting someone to sit with them 6 hours a day and facilitate their learning in the classroom. I think that seeing that we have made those changes and they're successful keeps me lobbying and working on changing things.
Mm-hmm. What do you think are the biggest challenges facing individuals with disabilities today? I realize that's a loaded question. As we've emphasized earlier, there's so many types of disabilities and the degrees of disability as well.
I think we still have significant social stigma, and I think that limits other people's views of what people with disability are able to do. And I think that's other people's expectations, poor expectations, are a big limiting factor. And that people with disability often take on other people's poor expectations. So if you're living in a society where you're continually told what you can't do, then that's going to limit your own expectations. So we need to change the national discourse to talk about what people can do instead. I think that not being able to find employment and not being able to find accessible housing that's affordable, those are two really, really big problems, particularly in the field of, in the area of psychosocial disability. If people don't have a place to live that's safe and is not an outbuilding or, these horrible places that people find themselves living in, then they're not going to be able to work on their mental health problems. They're not going to be able to find the stability that they need in order to flourish. So unless we get those basic things right, like housing, then people's lives they're not going to be able to take advantage of all the other stuff that we might put in place. Or if people are living in poverty because they can't find employment, they're really big problems that we need to overcome.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, thank you so much, Jen, for giving us so much time and
thank you, Ming.
thoughtful responses. And it's been great to have you on our show.
Thank you. And thank you so much for inviting me to talk to you. I appreciate it.
Did you like this video? If so, share it with your friends and be sure to follow us on social media. And if you want even more resources, be sure to sign up for our email updates on our website, traipsingglobal.com. Keep learning new perspectives, keep being inclusive, because it will make the world a better place for you and for everyone else. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll catch you on another episode of the Traipsing Global on Wheels podcast hour.